Hello, all. Dr. Kristina Hill's research examines the implications of rising sea levels for cities, especially as a driver for rising groundwater. Very few US cities, Miami excluded, have considered that impact yet. So she provides strategic advice to public agencies and private organizations and viewers like you who want to adapt to climate change while supporting biodiversity and social justice. Kristina works primarily in the San Francisco Bay Area and at UC Berkeley. Her research group recently produced a map of depth to groundwater in the SF Bay Area and a study of contaminated sites that may be affected by rising groundwater and the costs associated with that, and a proposal for urban mixed-use neighborhoods that would be adapted to flooding from rising seas and groundwater. So with that, Kristina, if you could take over the screen and take things away.
Great, let's see how this works. I'll try to share my slides. I'm not sure I'm in the meeting, but let's try.
Yeah.
Do you think folks can see that? Could we check?
Yes, we have your screen now.
Great, and folks can hear me.
Yes.
Okay, let me just get right into it. I want to talk today about how rising groundwater is going to affect the Bay Area, especially, but of course, cities all around the world. And then some ideas for how we could adapt and continue to build our Build-a-Palooza through that. So the Dutch have been thinking about this for hundreds of years, literally. And I learned about it from them in 2009, when they pointed out that sea level is going to be only one source of flooding. I'm going to call that inundation, where land might be flooded by sea level rise. Local rain and river flooding are other sources of problems, and then rising groundwater. And that's really pushed upwards by sea level. But let me remind folks too, since we're in California, what kind of groundwater I'm talking about. I'm talking about the really shallow stuff that if you dig down in the sand at the beach, you come to the groundwater. That's what I'm talking about, not the deep stuff that we use for drinking water. And shallow groundwater is really just water that fills the little pore spaces in the soil. It's often just below the surface, and it rises and falls seasonally. If we've had a lot of rain, it's going to be shallow. And if we haven't had much rain, then it's going to drop down deeper. And it's typically dirty, so it's not mapped because it's not a resource. It gets all the runoff from streets and cars and roofs. So it's not typically mapped, and we've had to do that to try to understand it in the Bay Area. This is a US Geological Survey cross-section that shows how it's related to the ocean. So the salt water, it's like it's got its toe under a pillow on the couch, and it's pushing up that pillow of fresh water that floats on top of the salty groundwater. And as the pressure and the depth of the sea increase, so as the sea gets deeper, it exerts more pressure by weight. It pushes that freshwater groundwater upwards next to the coast. And that's what I'm talking about. That's what I'm concerned about. Not the deeper stuff that we typically use for drinking water or even irrigation water. And you can see that this runs very deep. Even this shallow water can go down dozens, hundreds of feet along the coast of the bay. Sea level rise is expected to increase in rate after 2040. And we could see as much as 2 feet by 2060 and 6 feet by around 2090, 2100. So we're very concerned, everybody who's planning for this process, that not only is it definitely coming and unstoppable at this point, but it's also going to be accelerating. So we need some good ideas that will let us cope with an accelerating rate of environmental change. And this is the 20-year on-ramp right now between today and 2040, 2050. That's our on-ramp. So we need some good ideas. First, we have to understand what could go wrong. So I'm going to very quickly talk about using this kind of cartoon that I made to try to explain what happens. So as that darker blue salty groundwater rises, the lighter blue fresh groundwater gets pushed into pipes, storm sewer pipes, which means that there's less room for rainwater to go into those pipes, and also sewer pipes, which means there's less room for their function, which is to carry away wastewater. We're also going to see things that have been buried in the soil begin to be wetted. So a lot of contamination is left in our soils from the military, from industry, from gas stations, and that's going to be inundated as that groundwater rises, wetted, and then potentially mobilized, allowed to move around in the groundwater. We'll also start to see creeks that are normally dry have more water in them. And this is all happening even though there's a levee shown in this cartoon by the shoreline. Levees won't stop this. And in fact, groundwater could actually rise higher on the land side of the levee because of the presence of the levee blocking groundwater from discharging to the ocean. So levees and seawalls may actually make the situation worse. Over time, that creek will start to have more and more water in it, and then eventually we'll see flooding at the surface, but only after a lot of other things have gone wrong. So we can't wait until we see flooding, because that's a sign that everything else has already gone wrong first. And that could represent a lot of lost value. So for example, this diagram shows a storm sewer pipe filling up with groundwater. All it takes is a crack at the joints, and in a seismically active region like ours, there are a lot of crack joints. We'll see corrosion of foundations at a higher rate because a lot of our older buildings aren't designed to have their foundations in salty groundwater. They're designed for fresh groundwater. So we're going to see more corrosion, and that's going to create life safety risks as well as risks to infrastructure when we do have our seismic events. And speaking of seismic events, this is a photo from Christchurch, New Zealand, which shows what happened in an area of soil with a high water table. When their earthquake happened around 2012, 2010, cars actually dropped into the ground because it behaved like a liquid when the earthquake energy wave came through it. And then it solidified again when the energy wave was gone. And that's called liquefaction. So our building foundations, our infrastructure are all at risk of liquefaction. And one of the big predictors of liquefaction is the depth of the water table. So as the water table gets shallower, closer to the surface, we expect to see more areas prone to this extreme shaking and damage. And this is what it looks like when the water finally gets to the surface. You can already see this on Little Street on Bay Farm Island. That's part of Alameda, where the groundwater actually bubbles up through a manhole and starts to fill the street. So this is how we'll see flooding first. We'll see it, and we are seeing it, as a result of groundwater moving up our stormwater infrastructure and causing spot flooding. This is the contamination issue as an example. So there's a site owned by the AstraZeneca company in Richmond, right on the bay edge, and this is a king tide condition. You can see how high the high tide comes to the area that's flat and empty, and that's capped. So we've put a lot of caps on contaminated sites, but we haven't protected them from below. And as the sea level and the groundwater rise, very serious contaminants, like at this Seneca site, that cause cancer, that pollute the environment in serious ways, could be put in motion and start moving around that district because of rising groundwater. So there's kind of an umbrella on the site, but no rubber boots. The water is going to come right up and move those contaminants around. One of the ways it does that is contaminants that have a gas component, like a benzene or a gasoline, can enter a sewer pipe and then travel upwards as a gas into buildings. Could be a school, could be a workplace, could be a home. And indoor air can be polluted without people knowing it or expecting it. So that's one of the things we're really going to have to track. It's probably the biggest likely impact on human health, that gases will enter buildings because liquids have entered sewer pipes. we can see the risk of that at the Zeneca site, where all these little skinny whisker lines have been drawn from wells where VOCs have been identified. And as groundwater rises, the flow path that those VOCs or gases are likely to take are shown in the skinny black lines, and they cross a couple sewer lines over on the right and on the left of this image that would allow those gases to potentially enter buildings. So we know that it's going to be a risk, and we're studying that now to figure out where it might happen. This little cross section shows a building in a coastal area. Could be Mountain View, could be Alameda, could be Richmond or Marin. And it shows a sewer line that goes into the building, or actually carries sewage out of the building down to the center of the street. It has an area of contaminated soil with a parking lot. It has a foundation. And as people try to adapt to increased flooding, one of the things we expect people to do is to start pumping. If we pump in these coastal areas, the salty groundwater will actually rise up higher. That's what's shown with the dark blue. So that's called upconing. And that's a very serious problem because it could expose foundations to salty water along with sewer lines. And that's a result of pumping. I just want to emphasize that our pumping will make our situation a lot worse. So I've already said levees are going to make the situation worse, and pumping, which has to happen when you build levees, will also make the situation worse. And I just want to flip through a few slides that shows you how many contaminated sites are around the Bay Area. This is the Bayview Hunters Point area. You can see in the light blue areas where groundwater is going to rise with 3 feet of sea level rise, and the dark blue where it would actually be inundated by the bay. And all the little red dots are open sites where we know there's contamination. So they're all sitting in that zone where change is going to be happening that could mobilize them. This is South Richmond. Again, a ton of red circles showing open contaminated sites in the zone where groundwater is rising or inundation is going to occur. West Oakland, another situation with a lot of open sites and a lot of buildings where we've been trying to build greater density around transit-oriented development ideas. Here's East Oakland, again, a lot of sites, many open sites around the Coliseum, where new housing is being built and new development is expected. East Palo Alto, also a lot of open sites and a high risk of inundation and, of course, rising groundwater. So the question is, how can we build in this wetter future? And I'd like to offer some ideas that I think will help us, even though they may sound like science fiction. Our environment is changing in ways we've never experienced since cities were invented. So we really do need to be creative. So I'm going to talk about a Dutch idea called floodable development. And this is designed for areas with rising groundwater. The proposal is to dig out the contaminated soil, which is going to leave a pond behind in a high groundwater condition, and then float mixed use development up to 50 or 75 units per acre in the resulting artificial pond. So I am not talking about floating on the bay. I want to really emphasize that because from an ecological point of view, that would be real dumb. I'm talking about floating in artificial ponds that we would excavate for that specific purpose. Amsterdam has done this for about 600 years. They've been digging canals and piling mud up to try to help people stay in that landscape, even as it's been sinking and groundwater has been rising. So this is one way to live in a high groundwater floodable landscape is by living with canals. Those can be used to reduce the elevation of the water table. They've also been digging artificial ponds and building in them as a way to create beautiful housing environments that also accommodate a lot of water. And the Dutch development slogan is living with water. So they are in fact planning on having more and more water and trying to make that beautiful for themselves, which I think we can embrace and find ways to build and thrive with that higher water table using, like the Dutch, artificial ponds and canals. This is another example from Amsterdam where they're actually floating affordable units using prefabricated stacked units and floating them attached to pilings with slip collars, like at ferry and boat docks, that allow them to rise and fall with a couple feet of tide. And the piers themselves are fixed, but the buildings are floating. This is what that looks like at night. It's relatively kind of medium density from an American point of view, 22 units per acre. But if we did this with flats instead of with townhouses, we'd be able to go up to a higher density and still be floating. Americans float things. This is a floating hot dog stand in New Jersey. We know how to float stuff to have a good time. The Norwegians float things. They float saunas in the harbors. Very, very popular right now. The Germans float things. This is a floating heated swimming pool in Berlin with an associated deck and park. This would be really great for the Bay Area to make a fun space to learn about floating that actually adds an amenity. So the kinds of urban prototypes we've been talking about so far for the Bay Area in this kind of artificial pond idea are a very kind of technical version where the foundation, the floating foundation, actually fills the pond and you don't actually see the water. This is called a water displacement foundation by geotechnical engineers. The pond isn't treated as an amenity, it's just a strategy for living with earthquakes and high groundwater. And this technology was actually permitted in San Jose. This competition proposal that I worked on was to try to show what could happen in East Oakland at the Coliseum site, where we could do a pond and not necessarily fill it all with buildings and foundations, but actually leave some of that open as an amenity. And there are places all around the Bay. I'll wrap up with some images of where this could happen. The Aquatic Park in Berkeley, in Brisbane, south of San Francisco, a leftover lagoon where a highway cut it off from the bay edge, areas down in Mountain View where creeks and ponds exist that could be used for artificial ponds and prototype developments for mixed use and housing. And then, of course, this image is actually showing a proposal for East Palo Alto, where behind the levee, where the groundwater is going to rise anyway, there could be a floating development. So I'll leave you with that thought and see what kind of questions you have. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Kristina. There was one question, it seems like it disappeared, but I'd still like to ask it. It was asking you to define inundation.
Inundation just means flooding. And what I usually use it for is to refer to flooding that comes in from the side. As the ocean rises, some places are going to flood as the water moves sideways with the tides and waves. And I just use that word to distinguish it from water moving upwards from groundwater. And together we call them compound flooding.
Okay. There's a question about sewer cleanouts. Do they serve as an early warning system for buildings, and are there water traps in the public sewer system?
Water traps in the public sewer system. So anybody who lives in San Francisco knows that there are backups in that sewer system into basements, into people's homes, because they no longer discharge in a big wet weather event. They don't discharge to the bay. So San Francisco has to figure out how to store more rainwater. Otherwise, there's going to be a continuing pressure on sewer pipes that could back up into homes. And that's already evident. So the canary is singing in the coal mine, and we need to figure out how to listen.
Anthony Yulo asked about, do ponds also dampen the effect of earthquake waves?
They can. There's a pattern. If you go online and you look for earthquake and swimming pool, you'll see that ponds and pools can have a wave motion from the earthquake. It's called sesh. And the way to deal with that is to build in a kind of waffle iron pattern into the bottom of the pond that dampens that sesh and keeps the pond stable. So we know how to deal with it.
So you say, how do you spell sesh?
Seiche.
Ah, okay. Not what I thought.
Yeah, French wood.
What would reworking lots to absorb rainwater during storms so that no water drains to the storm drains help or not? I'm sorry if I
Yeah, no,
ask that again.
managing rainwater is really important, but that's going to get even harder as the groundwater rises in the soil. Sometimes people talk about sponge cities, sponge strategies for rain. If the sponge is already wet, you can't get any more water into it. So we'll have to actually store rainwater at the surface in parks, parking lots, wherever we can, roofs, and the soil will be full. So it's going to be hard to store water in the soil in the future with sea level rise. So really we need to deal with both the rain and the water in the soil.
I remember seeing something about New York City, their stormwater, their range of what they would accept for stormwater, it was engineered a long time ago, is greatly exceeded but what they're projecting. And they did have quite extensive flooding, I think, in the Bronx and Westchester County, based on that.
Some of their proposals for how to adapt to sea level rise include earthen walls as well as concrete walls. And that's going to make it harder to let that rain flow from the middle of the island out to the ocean. We're going to have that same problem where if we build walls at the shoreline, it's going to be hard to let the rain out.
Yes, that's interesting. I believe this is a while ago that you presented in Foster City, because they were doing things, obviously Foster City has been living with water for quite a while. But I think from what I wasn't at that presentation, Jennifer Thompson was, and she came back shocked.
Yeah, a city like a place like Foster City or Belmarin Keys in the north, or even parts of Alameda and East Oakland, they could flip the script and put their buildings on the water and keep their land for roads and parks. And that would allow them to stay in those locations for a lot longer.
This would be the last question about Mountain View. There is excavation of contaminated soil and groundwater at the Fairchild Superfund site. Should they build one of the ponds you described instead, or will this make that particular area worse?
I don't know all the specifics of that, but when we excavate soil and we leave a void, that's an opportunity to pilot this kind of development by just moving dirt around, which is a low cost and good long-term strategy for adapting to our new environment. Just moving dirt around, we can all do that. And that's something that would allow us to adapt and even be flexible in the future, where a seawall can't be moved, dirt can. So we know a lot about how we can adapt if we start using those strategies of earth moving. So I would say that is a good situation where we should be piloting something.
It's very interesting. Well, thank you for bringing all this to our attention. I mean, it does have a tremendous impact in terms of the built or the soon to be built environment. Hopefully, some of these ideas can be incorporated instead of perhaps making things worse.
Right. And we have a housing crisis. So we should be trying to make new housing that's beautiful and sustainable. And I hope that our industries will see the need for that kind of housing for workers who would enjoy it.
It's so interesting that so much of the world should be learning from Amsterdam.
Right, where they've made a lot of mistakes, but they've kind of figured it out by trial and error over time.
Yeah. Well, thank you once again for coming to Build-A-Palooza. And I know I've learned a lot and also looking at things to look into. So thanks very much.
Great. Thanks for inviting me. Take care, Dennis. Bye, everyone.